There are more than 1,200 people reported missing in the state of Oregon, nearly 200 of them from right here in Lane County. Thank you for joining us. I'm Matt Templeman. This evening, anchor Chelsea Deffenbacher takes a look at one that has grown cold over the past 20 years, shedding light for the first time on the case of Wendy DeHoop, missing but not forgotten.
It's been 20 years since a Cottage Grove wife and mother disappeared. Wendy DeHoop failed to show up for work, raising alarm for two coworkers who called authorities. Days later, a South Eugene resident spotted her car in the Friendly neighborhood, a long way from her home. Her purse was found on the ground just outside of her car, but no one has seen Wendy since. In a new series looking into the cold cases of Lane County, I take a closer look at a case that's bothered neighbors for years.
These people had lives. They mattered. Lives matter. You know, they had hopes and dreams. She had hopes and dreams. She had a son. What happened to her? Nobody knows.
It was just an average Friday morning in April 2005 when a woman failed to show up for work.
Two of her coworkers reported her missing, essentially not showing up to work, which was unusual.
44-year-old Wendy DeHoop worked at the Georgia Pacific Mill in Halsey. She was reported to have been wearing a black pinstriped pantsuit and possibly a silver ring on her left finger. Early reports in newspapers across the country said she had dropped her husband Dan off at work at the Home Depot on Delta Highway in Eugene before heading off to work. But Sergeant Tim Wallace of the Lane County Sheriff's Office said that piece of information proved to be untrue.
We do have still images from the surveillance video at Home Depot of her husband arriving for work.
There were also reports that one of the coworkers who reported Wendy missing was having an affair with her, but Wallace declined to confirm that.
I know that information is out there, but for our purposes, it was two coworkers that reported her missing.
Deputies quickly sprang into action and went to talk to her husband Dan at the Home Depot. Sergeant Wallace says it appears deputies were the first to inform Dan that his wife was missing. Wallace declined to disclose what else came of that conversation or the numerous other conversations they've had with Dan since that day.
At the time, he did not believe she was missing from how his morning had gone or whatever information he had at the time. So the first he heard about it was when he was contacted by law enforcement.
A week went by without any sighting of Wendy, but then a lead when a person on Lorraine Highway reported finding Wendy's purse and car just east of Fillmore Street.
The car and the purse were found at the same time in the same location. The purse was outside of the car, but they were both found at the same time. Because of the suspicious nature of it, that person was investigated and they were cleared.
The sheriff's office declined to release a police report, citing an active investigation.
To this day, I don't know anything. Nobody does. That's a shame.
2 months after Wendy disappeared, Dan DeHoop got new neighbors. The Tolmachoffs moved onto the 18-acre property next door to Dan's 5 acres on Wagner Lane and Row River Road across from Dorena Lake. The Tolmachoffs' property had been vacant for at least a year before they moved in. David Tolmachoff tells me he and his family knew nothing about what had happened to their neighbor's wife until one day they got a knock at the door.
Frankly, it wasn't until the LEO showed up. And trust me, a lot of them did. You know, first it was 1 or 2, then 6, then 7. There were probably a dozen or 15. Eugene PD, Cottage Grove PD, OSP, probably the feds, you know, and the black SUVs. They were everywhere, constantly for a couple of months. You know, it eventually tapered off. And we found out that, yeah, Wendy, Dan's wife, went missing. You know, it's like, what happened? Nobody knew. The first time they came was when they asked us if we would give them permission to search our property. They searched long and hard, didn't find anything, or at least not that we know of.
There were a lot of searches in that area by search and rescue, including canines. We didn't have drones at the time, 20 years ago, so it was a very manpower intensive, and they searched a lot of properties in that area.
David said he never talked to his neighbor about Wendy, and it still bothers him to this day where she might be.
I didn't think it was our place to ask, you know, it's none of our business. You know what I mean? How do you approach somebody like that? Hey, what happened to your wife? You know, you just don't. So no, we never did. Neighbors talk, people talk. So there were stories, there were rumors, fingers of blame being pointed in all different directions. None of our business, you know? Nobody knows anything. That's the problem.
A year after Wendy disappeared, court records show Dan filed for divorce and sought child support from Wendy. That case was eventually closed without Wendy, awarding the dissolution, full custody of the couple's son, who was just 12 years old at the time, and all of the couple's possessions, including Wendy's bank accounts and her car that had been found. By 2008, however, the state filed for child support from Dan, as the couple's son was by that time in the care of the state. Dan did not return calls or messages seeking comment for this story. The couple's son declined to speak to me, expressing through a girlfriend his wishes to move on. Wendy's family also declined to speak, saying it's just too painful to talk about her disappearance.
A woman went missing. People go missing all the time. Unfortunately, in this area, surprisingly, a lot of people have gone missing. Nothing. No information, no knowledge, just gone.
Sometimes the hardest part about any missing person case is just not knowing, and it's certainly even harder when, a case like this where it's a lot more suspicious, and it's just a lot more difficult with all those unanswered questions for families.
You don't have the answers to your missing family members or friends. All you're left with is questions, and years go by, people tend to forget. It's a shame.
I'm told that while the sheriff's office cold case detectives are involved in this case, this is still very much an active investigation and is still being worked. Sergeant Wallace tells me if anyone out there knows anything or saw anything around that time that might be related to this case, to please reach out. No tip is too small or too insignificant to report. In the studio, I'm Chelsea Deffenbacher.